David and I and Leslie are all involved in historic groups in the Groton Bank area, as well as other parts of the of town. But we are very dedicated to the history, and much of this book you'll find is a history book, because much of what these stories come from is from the history of this area. So we had a lot of shared ideas and similar sympathies. And as it turned out, periodically we'd be sitting around talking, and the subject of ghost stories would come up. Well, is your museum haunted? Is your library haunted? Is there, what do you know? And we would tell stories about what we've heard or what people have said, what people have seen. And that led to the ghost tours, the Groton Bank ghost tours. Has anybody been on our ghost tours? Those were, yes. Those were held the past 3 years, I believe, starting at the Avery Cop Museum and circling through the neighborhood, through the fort, up to Bill Memorial Library, and then ending down at the Mother Bailey House back on Thames Street. Subsequently, after about 3 years of selling out and having a great response to these ghost tours, I happened to be, it was my last, I think it was the last time I had a chance to attend a book conference before I retired after 35 years at the library. I was at a book expo, and I'm looking at I was going around through all the vendors, and there was the History Press. And I'm looking at their offerings, and I see was it Mystic? The Haunting of Mystic, and the Haunting of Connecticut, and the Haunting of this, and the Haunting of that. And I'm looking at this Haunted America series, and I thought, oh, well, we've got a story. We're Haunted Connecticut. So I spoke with one of the representatives at that booth, and she gave me her card, and she said, get in touch. And of course I didn't. I wanted to talk to David and Leslie and a few others and see what they thought of the idea. We thought it might be, we had the material, we certainly have the history. We thought it might be fun to put this together as ultimately a fundraiser for the restoration of the Mother Bailey House also on Thames Street. So ultimately, I did contact the company. We sent in a proposal, got a contract, and next thing you know, we have Ghosts of Groton Bank, which came out on August 29th of this year. Just a word about the Mother Bailey House. If you're not familiar with it, of course, there's quite a bit of it in the book, and you'll read about it. It's an historic house. It's a very important historic property. Currently, it's in a state of deterioration, to the point that it really can't be open to the public. It can't be walked in. There's severe structural damage, and it's unsafe. The city has had a task force looking into ways to save it. The DAR, the Anna Warner Bailey chapter of the DAR, is also getting involved in ways to save it. It cannot be demolished because it's on the National Register. So royalties from this book will go towards whatever entity is charged with restoring the property, because it's too important to let pass from our realm. When I mentioned that history is a big part of it, I think a lot of it starts with, a lot of the backbone of our stories comes from the Battle of Fort Griswold. And I'm going to turn it over to David to talk about the battle, because nobody knows more about the battle than David does. And you can tell us the history of people who don't know it and some of the stories.
Sure. Well, when Leslie and Hali contacted me about writing a book, I was a little hesitant. Yeah, I am pretty knowledgeable in the history of Fort Griswold, but I haven't written anything other than some training manuals when I was working at Pfizer, so I was a little hesitant to do it, but I agreed to. And I went about looking at more research, because I have researched the battle quite thoroughly. I do use a narrative from Stephen Hempstead in there. Now, there are all kinds of versions of the battle. And the reason I selected Stephen Hempstead. I didn't steal it. And the reason I selected Stephen Hempstead was because of his experience. He fought at Bunker Hill, he fought at another battle in New York, and he was a first sergeant. So he had been in for a while and probably was the most reliable witness of the battle because of his battle experience. So that's why I selected him. And that was my choice, but, you know, everybody has to make a selection on their own feelings. The information in there is accurate as far as the numbers of people that were there, the numbers that were killed, the numbers that were taken as prisoners, and the numbers that were furloughed. All of that is correct. I also did some other research on, when we talked about ghosts, research on why do spirits hang around? You know, why would they be here? And clearly, most paranormals use the theory that they stay around because of several different factors. One, they're in love with somebody and can't bear to leave. Two, that they were so enamored with the place they don't want to leave it. Or three, something hazardous happened and they can't understand why. They feel that they were betrayed and can't understand what happened to them. So they're here trying to find answers. Now, taking that into consideration, when you talk about the Battle of Groton Heights, or Fort Griswold, it's called the Battle of Groton Heights, really. We had 184 men and a boy, a 12-year-old boy, against 800 British soldiers. Now, when I say 165 men and a boy, you have to realize that most of those were not soldiers. They were shopkeepers and farmers against 800 battle-toughened British regulars as well as German Hessians. And I was asked one time, why would Colonel Ledyard defend the fort with so few people? He should have known that he couldn't do it, and he did. As you'll read in the book about the battle, there was a council of war, and Colonel Ledyard, knowing that he couldn't hold the fort, was talking about giving the fort up. But there was a militia colonel there who promised him 300 men within 10 minutes if he would hold the fort. With that promise, Colonel Ledyard decided that he would not give up the fort, gave his reply to the British, closed the gates, and that was it. Think of the Alamo. They were there against thousands of Mexicans waiting for relief. The relief never came. So when the British finally breached the fort, Colonel Ledyard told his men to throw down their arms. He was surrendering the fort. And at the time, there was only about 12 dead. But the British decided that that wasn't enough. Their blood was up, and they continued killing. At the end of the battle, 88 were dead. 45 were wounded so severely that they couldn't be taken prisoner. They were actually furloughed because they would never survive the trip to New York aboard a prison ship. So why would ghosts be around? There's a lot of men were killed there, including British. And did they really want to be there? Probably not. You know, they probably didn't want to be there fighting, but they had to obey orders. So, and British soldiers have, you know, British soldiers were buried right there in mass graves by the British after the battle and left. And why were they left behind? That's probably one of the questions they had to ask. You know, so read it. I think you'll enjoy it. And if you have any questions later, we'll be glad to answer them.
Something to keep in mind was at the time of the battle, the neighborhood as we know it was mostly farmland, not even a lot of trees. It was mostly farmland, and it spread out for what are now blocks. So people who live there now, whose houses were built even in the 50s, there's one person who lives not far from the fort on a contiguous street that wasn't laid out at the time. It was still just farmland, has reported hearing militia marching through her basement hearing their armature jingling. In the 50s, when sewers were being laid or relaid in the city on Meridian Street, in front of one of the oldest houses from 1717, a body and artifacts of a British soldier were recovered from the street. So you know that they died where they fell and were probably buried where they fell. We did call in the Thames Society of Paranormal Investigation to do investigations at 3 sites: the Avery Cobb House, the Mother Bailey House, and the Bill Memorial Library. One of the things that they found at the library, one of the sensitives who came, they called them sensitives instead of mediums, I guess that's the more fashionable word. These people had not been told where they were going or what had happened there. They were just given an address and said to show up in an hour. And one of the women sensitives said that she felt the presence of soldiers milling around in the property outside the library. That she had the sense of somebody hanging from a tree, but we have no corroboration. I don't even think there were trees there. So that, I'll give that. But she did have the sense that there were people walking around, soldiers walking around. And in fact, many of the stories, one of the chapters in the book just recounts neighborhood happenings. And many of them seem to involve soldiers in people's houses. One woman who lived down the hill lived in a house that was actually, she was the wife of one of the seamen, one of the men who went off to whale or
Commerce. It should be commerce.
Commerce, right. And her husband never came back. So when she eventually married her brother-in-law and moved around the corner. But the woman who lives in that house now, we don't know if whoever's there with her is a soldier, or maybe the husband came back and found his wife gone. We don't know, but he's been described variously. And it fits with the description of all the soldiers who died, in the neighborhood and are buried there. In the Mother Bailey house, which is down on Thames Street, quite a bit away. Again, it wasn't there at the time. It was built a few years later. But currently, the meter men, the meter readers, I think they were meter readers, were in the basement at the Mother Bailey house. They might have been doing something else, but the city owns Mother Bailey right now. So they were in there, and a man, one of the city employees, turned and saw a soldier with his rucksack and his regalia standing right there, and he took a picture of him. The picture didn't translate. None of the pictures, surprisingly, none of the ghost pictures that we have, and I have a couple I can share with you, reproduced in the book. The publishers didn't work. But the photographs themselves exist, and if you look at this, the one that that shows the soldier in the Mother Bailey house, I believe it's a property of Mayor Galbraith right now. You could clearly see the outline of this, what appears to be a soldier, standing right there, completely oblivious to these men doing whatever work they had to do in the basement. So we feel fairly strongly that a lot of the activity has to do with what went on at the fort. It was a ghastly battle with tremendous loss of life, and that can't go unnoticed. But getting back to the fort, there are some interesting haunting stories that David is personally familiar with. Mm-hmm. If you'd like to share that.
Yeah. Well, one of them involves my stepson, who was in his teens at the time, and him and 2 of his friends were sitting up on the ramparts at night, watching the water.
Warning: don't go there at night.
When all of a sudden, they felt something brush. All 3 of them at the same time felt something brush the back of their heads. They turned around and there was nothing there. And they got out of the fort as fast as they could, and it took them a long time before they could go back at night. We were doing a candlelight vigil in the fort one evening. I think it was the first one we did.
Friends of Fort Griswold,
The
for
Friends of Fort
commemorating the
Griswold.
battle.
Commemorating the battle, we had 88 luminaries lit, and we read off the names of those who were killed and extinguished each light as the names were called to indicate the death of the 88 defenders. And, you know, all of a sudden, a chill breeze came up, and people were looking around as if they were feeling people there. And there were people who said that they felt something there. It was a very eerie feeling.
What time of the year did you do that?
This was right around Labor Day weekend. That's when we normally do it.
The time of the battle, September
Well,
6th.
Yeah, it was, it might have been the anniversary that date, because one day we did actually do it on the anniversary. And we did it at dusk, so the sun was setting, so you could see the candles, the luminaries. And, you know, it was very quiet, and then all of a sudden this breeze came up, and it was like, whoa, what was that? And, you know, figures have been seen in the fort. A figure had been seen in the gate with a tricorner hat. A vision was seen in the tunnel. It wasn't very clear, but there was a vision. People have had stones thrown at them by unseen hands. There's been, people have heard footsteps in the fort when it was empty. All that was standing there was them. And then one of the eeriest one was a little girl crying out, "No, no, no!" Now, these were all related to me. Some of them, the thing with the friends I witnessed, and of course my stepson's story was told to me, and I don't think he was lying about it. But I also had, after the book was written, one of the neighbors down the street tells me he takes his dogs into the fort at night, which is not supposed to be in there anyway, but he takes his dogs in at night, and clearly they sense something there. Mm-hmm. And he's had the same feeling in his house, which is just down the street from me. Mm-hmm. They've since moved, so I can't have them come in and relate it, but...
It's too bad Leslie's not here with us, because when she was walking her dog for many, many years in the fort at night, she had the same feeling. Also related to the battle, David was talking about the wounded. They were put on a cart to be taken off at the bottom of the hill, the bottom of Fort Street, to the British ships to be taken, the ones who could be taken prisoner were to be taken back to England. And as they were going down the hill, they were in a cart of some sort. The cart broke loose and went careening down the hill and slammed into an apple tree at the very bottom of the hill. If you go to the little park at the end of Fort Street, where the water taxi comes in, there's a millstone there inscribed in honor of the people who died there. It hit the tree, and to this day, people say they can still hear the screaming of the wounded and dying as they were lying there thrown from the cart. Those who could be saved were brought to the Ebenezer Avery House, which at the time was right there on the corner of Thames Street and Fort. It has since been moved to the fort and is open for tours in the summer. We were not able to get too many stories from the personnel there, but there were, again, the people reading the meter, going into the basement and hearing somebody walking along the floor upstairs, thinking that staff had come for the day, so it was time to go, go say hello and then leave. And they get upstairs and the place was empty. There was nobody there. The blood stains were on the floor for many, many, many years. I think they're gone now, but they never took them up. It became a number of other concerns. There was a store there for a while. There were a couple of apartments. But fortunately, an Avery descendant, had the house moved up into the fort. It's now part of the park and owned by the state of Connecticut and maintained by the state of Connecticut. But it figured very prominently in the battle. At the time, it's all related, you know? Mother Bailey, Anna Warner Bailey, she was Anna Warner at the time. She was a little girl, and she was staying with family. And in Ledyard, I believe, and was asked to go to the fort to find an uncle. And she went to the fort, found her uncle. It was hard to identify people because they were all just laying there, all, broken and bloodied. Found him. I believe it was she who contacted Dr. Prentice, who then came and tended to the wounded. So she presumably had an interaction with Amos Prentice. She went back to Ledyard, got the family, because he knew he was dying. The uncle knew he was dying, and he wanted to see his family. So she went back to the family. They got on their own horses, came to the fort to see him just before he died. But what's interesting is Amos Prentice, who did minister to the injured after the battle, built his house is what's called the Mother Bailey House. It's actually the Dr. Amos Prentice house. But Anna Warner married, what's Bailey's first name? I can't remember. Mr. Bailey, who was the postmaster, and they set up shop in the Amos Prentice house. So this house has had many lives. But it's interesting, we like to think that Anna Warner and Dr. Prentice may have intersected. The time, it was off by several years because she was just a child at the time of the battle, but she ended up in his house. So we think there's sort of an interesting connection there. Among the many things that was done in this house, besides it being a post office, at one time, Mother Bailey, she was called Mother Bailey because it was a term, an honorific. It was a term of respect. She was mother. Didn't have any children. She and Mr. Bailey didn't have children. But for a while, they ran a tavern in the basement. It's still there. If you're lucky enough to go into the basement, you can see the space. We met a man yesterday at a signing who was married to a woman whose parents owned the house 35, 40 years ago. And he was one of the workers who was helping to do some restoration. He uncovered the beehive oven in the basement. Because it was a tavern that served food and drink to travelers who came through. And it was apparently a very lively place. Mother Bailey was known to dance a jig now and again. But since then, one of the reasons the house is in such poor shape is because it passed out of the hands of residential owners to somebody who broke it up into apartments and did not respect the building, and there was a lot of damage done as well as a lot of neglect. It's a 300-some-odd-year-old building. There was a lot of neglect. So there were times when people would be in the building and they would hear the sounds of merriment coming from the basement. There were two stories. One, Mother Bailey hated the British, hated them, obviously because of what they did at Fort Griswold. And apparently one of the renters of one of these apartments over the past number of years brought in an English girlfriend, a British girlfriend. And in the middle of the night, this woman went screaming from the house, would never go back, and would never explain what happened. But it was well known how Mother Bailey felt about the British, so it was surmised that she did something to get this girl out of the house. Another time, after the house was empty, I believe a couple of kids were in there. I don't know by what means. And they were up in the attic, exploring the attic, when they started hearing the sounds of a party coming from the basement, and they were terrified. They stayed there all night shaking, and then as soon as it was light out and the sounds went away, he came tearing out of the house, and they never went back. So there's a lot of good stories, and there's a lot of eyewitness evidence of things that can't be explained. Doesn't mean that there's not an explanation, but there are things that can't be explained. When the Thames Society for Paranormal Investigation investigated the Mother Bailey house, I didn't bring the report with me. It's probably in here. After a while, it all gets mixed up. There's a lot of the tavern stories. They did not find a whole lot in the house, But they did talk to Mother Bailey, and Mayor Galbraith actually has the recording. They're talking to her, and they say, "Mother Bailey, did you, what the one, okay, I have to back up and just jump ahead a little bit in time. One of the things that Anna Warner Bailey was very famous for was during the War of 1812. They, again, American soldiers were defending the fort in case they were attacked. And they ran, but because they were afraid of what happened during the Battle of Fort Griswold, when much of Groton Bank and New London was burned, a lot of the residents and the neighbors took off. She stayed. And the militia at the fort were going from door to door desperate for cannon wadding because they didn't have any. In case the ships came to shore, they wanted to be able to shoot off the cannons and defend themselves. And so the story is that she went out into the street to see what was going on. They said, "We need flannel for cannon wadding." And as the story goes, she lifted up her skirt, dropped her red flannel petticoat, gave it to the soldiers to use for cannon wadding. I believe that the story is that when they went back, realized they didn't need it, they ran it up the flagpole in honor of Mrs. Bailey. But one of the investigators during the paranormal investigation asked her about that, and he said, "Mother Bailey, is it true that you gave your petticoat to be used as cannon fodder?" Now, fodder is not the same as wadding at all. And what the voice that you can hear on the tape says, there's some crackles, and then you hear, "You're crazy!" And you can hear it so clearly, because she knew it wasn't for cannon fodder, it was for cannon wadding. That was quite remarkable. They also did an investigation at the Avery Copp House. Are you familiar with the Avery Copp House Museum on Thames Street? It is a gorgeous house museum, been in the same family now for since the early 1800s. Started life as a center chimney colonial and ended up as a Victorian in the mid-1800s. But there have been reports of a woman in a second floor window looking out, and one of our board members happens to live next door, and a couple of times he's looked up and seen a light or seen a shadow, and he just pulls the shades down because he doesn't want to deal with it. But there have been stories of people sleeping there. A painter was sleeping there while he was working on doing some painting in the house, and apparently went to bed in a bed that he shouldn't have been sleeping in, according to whoever was still hanging around there. And he was roused in the night, basically did not go into that. I think he slept in the barn the rest of the time. He wouldn't go back in the house to sleep anyway. They did find a number of, quite a bit of activity, a lot of it on the third floor, which was the servants' quarters. The Avery Copp family had maids, mostly Irish maids. That was very common in the late 1800s. And the Irish maids would live up in the attic. That's where the rooms are. And if you go there now, you can see that the servants' quarters have been restored, and it's really interesting. But at any rate, they went up into the attic, the investigators did, and at one point they heard, in fact, Leslie's daughter was with them. She was a docent there many years ago. And she was with the investigators when they heard a very soft female voice saying, "Please go." Because men weren't allowed up there. These were innocent Irish girls who came over to make their living, send their money back to the families, and they didn't want men up there. We've had men up there when we've had tours, and I've never experienced anything or seen anybody thrown down the stairs. But there was a lot of activity there. People have been seen walking through the house. There's a number of things that really can't be explained. People ask us, "Do you believe in ghosts?" And I guess what we usually just say is, there's an awful lot we don't know, and we can't explain. I think some of the best stories aren't from the historic buildings like Mother Bailey or Avery Copper, even Bill Memorial, which has presumably a man and 2 women up in the local history room, as well as a few other things. Some of the best stories really come from the people in the neighborhood. Do any of you, or have you, any of you been to the Subvets or the Fleet Reserve for events? Have you noticed anything while you were there? Which one were you at?
Is it the Subvet?
The Subvets?
Yeah.
That's the one on
Sub-
School Street.
Hmm?
That's the one on School Street.
Yeah, you want to talk about that?
Oh, good, you got the picture.
Oh, I don't have the one from, no, that's from the Fleet.
On the Fleet
No,
Reserve?
Subvets, apparently there's, the Subvets has been many different things in its life, and it actually, back in the early 50s, it was a live theater. And the big room, if you've been in there, that big main room they call the, actually I don't know what, it's where they meet, not the pump room down below, but the main floor. If you look, you could see the box office in front, you can see the stairways going up to what would have been a balcony that's now offices, and there's a stage. So a woman whose father worked there at the time is a sensitive, and she came in with a friend, and they went behind the curtain at a time, I don't know what time of the day, I'm guessing the place was empty. And she does a kind of investigation called, oh, what is it? She takes a pendant, and it's a crystal, and she tests it to make sure it's neutral, and then she asks questions, and the way the pendant moves spells things out. I'm not familiar with it. I'm not remotely sensitive. There could be somebody sitting here between us, and we wouldn't know. But this woman was, and she said that there were 2 ghosts there, a man and a woman, who were involved in the theater. And people there at Subvets down in the pump room have seen doors opening. They've seen somebody left, came back unexpectedly, and saw fog over the pool tables. There have been a number of mysterious footsteps. Of course, everybody hears footsteps. At the Fleet Reserve, they give parties, and apparently this picture, I could pass this around, was taken at one of the parties. I think it was looks like a Christmas party. And 3 women who were partying there had their picture taken, and it wasn't until the picture was developed that you can see what looks like a face, maybe whispering into the ear of one of the women. And I'll pass this around if you'd like to look at it. One of the women, who was a patron there, not anybody it's not somebody I interviewed, but somebody who got back to me afterwards, said that she and her husband had taken their picture outside, just, taking their picture after an event, and when they got home and developed it, there was somebody between them in the picture. I couldn't get a hold of that. So that's just one of those stories. At Bill Memorial, as I mentioned, they believe that the activity is mostly upstairs in the North Room, which is genealogy, but they did get a photograph of what looks like a man in the basement. And when I saw this picture, it seems pretty obvious to me it's a man's shoulder looking towards the windows. It's hard to tell, but I'll pass that around too because it's fun. We have voices at Bill Memorial. At one point, 2 women investigators were up in the genealogy room, in the North Room, and said, "Do you mind that we're women?" And there's a big pause, and then you hear laughter, men and women. You just hear this laughter like, are you kidding? Do we like women? It's very eerie to listen to. But some of the best stories are the neighborhood stories, the Subvets, the Fleet, the woman was in the house where the sailor man had gone off to sea and never came back. Well, the woman who lives there now was physically pushed almost down the stairs. And finally, she just got tired of it, and she yelled at it, and she said, "Look, this is my house. If you want to be here, that's fine. You go your way, I'll go mine." And she never had another experience like that again. What other stories are there?
Fort Griswold, there were some instances where one of the workers at the fort had seen a man sitting about halfway up the stairs of the monument, the steps of the monument. And as he'd get closer to it, it would disappear. In the museum house, they have motion detectors in there, and when the place was closed up, locked up, nobody was in there, the alarms would go off. They would find things moved within the museum. And at the Hubbard House, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with the fort, but it's a
Big yellow stone.
big yellow stone house that's on the property of the fort. They've had a lot of strange occurrences there, so they call this paranormal. His name was David Pitkin, and he wrote a book called The Ghosts of New England, and he came up and investigated. And he, explained to George, who had called him up and asked him how you could get closer to a spirit, because spirits don't like to be looked at face on. You know, if you look at them off to the side, you kind of look away from them a little bit, you can get closer to them. He believed that that spirit was probably not involved with the battle, but some of the other things that had happened, he wasn't too sure of. So after he got done talking to this gentleman, he took a walk over into the fort. And he's looking around, he's looking at the earthworks, and he's looking for the place where Colonel Ledger was killed, and found it. And he walked around back towards the Sally Port, which is the tunnel. And as he was walking back towards the gate, he's thinking about all that had happened there. And he's thinking to himself, I wonder if all the spirits have left. And a voice answered him, "You'd be a fool to think so." And there was nobody there.
And he never said it out loud.
And he didn't say it out loud. So, draw your own conclusions.
There are a number of great stories that you'll read about. There are many different kinds of manifestations that people report. They see things, they hear things, or they smell things. There's one account in the book where the owner frequently smells what smells like stew. Her house, again, we're talking about old houses that were built in the 1800s for the most part, on land that probably is contiguous to the fort. So who knows? There are no answers. There's only the experiences that people who live there have. There's another woman not too far, a little out of the neighborhood. She has, she sometimes smells her grandmother behind her in the kitchen. It was her grandmother's house. Another one, I think it's the same one who smells the stew, also smells baking bread. That's not bad. I mean, I wouldn't mind coming home to that. I was at the Bill Memorial Library for 35 years, and people would routinely come in and say, "Oh, it's got to be haunted." And I say, well, not that I know of. And I never, as I said, I'm not sensitive, so I never sensed anything. But things happened. Strange things did happen at Bill. Things would just appear in one place when they'd never been there before. We'd never seen certain objects, and you walk into a room and there's something sitting on a shelf that was never there. Nobody knows where it came from. There have been instances of things being moved. At one point, we had a typewriter, because there was always the need for a typewriter, but it never had a permanent home because it really was only used occasionally. So it was moved from place to place. And at one point, one of the staff members picked up the typewriter to move it. After it had been moved dozens and dozens of times, there's a paper under, a very old paper, handwritten, was a grocery list that just had never, I mean, the building had been renovated, the typewriter had been moved dozens of times. And here's a piece of paper with a grocery list on it that had never been, and clearly quite old. I don't have answers. Oh, but the best part, the only thing I did experience there, but again, I just sort of blew it off, was I'd be able to smell a pipe. And I'd walk out of my office and I'd say to the rest of my coworkers, does anybody smell that? And occasionally people would smell a pipe. I'd walk in sometimes smelling cigarettes, but mostly pipe. But we always used to joke and say, oh, it's Mr. Bill. It's Mr. Bill. You know, his portrait hung over a fireplace. We talked to him all the time. We're very grateful for his generosity of having created the library as well as a school, a church, a number of other things. But what really clinched it was after I retired. The woman who became director after I, several months into her first year, walked out of the office and said to the staff, does anybody else smell pipe? Thank you for coming.